It's often seen as, oh, it's this anti-institutional thing, and it's actually, it's not really. It's just that we do things our way, and then it ends up kind of undermining the institution. I'm Raju. Raju Rage is my artist name, and I am an artist, an educator. I'm involved in organising, also in curating.
The curatorial is inherent to all aspects of my practice across various outcomes precisely because of coming from being socialized and educated from outside of a dominant hegemonic system that produces art, which means I just do things differently or unexpectedly in a non-normative way that can't be pinned down, whether that's an artwork, project, an event, a resource, or anything else. I don't really feel confined to one way of working or one medium or place constraints on what I do. I prefer to let things shape organically and with connectivity.
I'm interested in the culinary word, food. I'm interested in print. I'm interested in kind of self-published materials. I think that's the main thing. And kind of self-organized movements. I'm part of two collectives, the main one being Collective Creativity, and that's with Evan Ifakoya, Raisa Kabir, Rudy Lowe, and myself. And also part of APAC, which is the studio that we're in today, which is a People's Art Collective, which is kind of a more looser collective that's based here at Raven Row. We decided to set up the collective because we felt like we really needed a space as artists of color. I came from a background of kind of self-organizing, DIY and DIT culture. So like do it yourself, do it together kind of culture. It just seemed natural. We're like, we're frustrated with our institutions. Let's just do our own thing. Let's just organize our own space. And they kind of functioned at first as kind of these roundtables. We started to do some self-initiated research around, well, what happened before, what came before, and trying to kind of figure out what was the trajectory of artists of color in Britain, right? Because we were facing these struggles and we were thinking, well, what happened? We can't be the first ones to have gone through this, right? So we had all these roundtable sessions that were actually at the Tate. Evan was working there, so they were kind of unofficial, kind of like this fugitive study that Fred Moten speaks about. We were kind of like in the building, but they didn't know we were there, just kind of taking up the resource that we had access to. But it was really about thinking, as a younger generation, not having the information, not having the knowledge, not having the access. We were kind of questioning that. Like, yes, there was Innova. This was kind of born out of the Black Arts movement. We had this space. But it wasn't like it was easy to have that connection or that access with that place. So we kind of were like, if you're thinking about lineage and heritage and how that's passed on, there were some fractures, right? We're also talking about the failure of the Black Arts movement because for the fact, which is a really realistic fact, is that people are still experiencing the same issues. Maybe not the same, but in a very similar way, right? We're still experiencing racism in Britain, right? It wasn't a failure of the Black Arts movement, but there's a general failure that exists around that. But that session, there was like 40 people there, and people like Sonia Boyce came, and Paul Goodwin came, and Keith Piper came, and Ingrid Pollard came, and lots of those people that we were speaking about in terms of this kind of Black Arts movement came to that session. And I guess they were just like, what is happening? What's being said about us, and wanted to kind of have this conversation. But what was great was that it became this really intergenerational conversation. And there was tension in the conversation, but it was really generative and productive. And, through those sessions and through those connections and nurturing them, we did, we were doing a lot of kind of archival research. So we went to the Innova Stuart Hall Library, which is where a lot of our collective research was happening. We were reading texts like Stuart Hall's and Rashid Areen, who were very kind of critical about the art institutional frameworks, were also speaking around their positionality as people of color in Britain and the racism they faced in the late 60s and 70s. The collective work that we did was really around uncovering those histories and those legacies of the Black Arts movement and how it was framed, because that's what we also realized within the archives, that they were framed in a very specific way. And we struggled with a lot of archives. I think the Innova, the Stuart Hall Library and the Making Histories archive were the ones that we really loved, and also the Ruckus archive by Ajamu and Topher Campbell. This whole idea of like categorization is a very violent thing. Archives are colonial anyway, right? So it's a very kind of, it comes from this kind of very hostile, harmful origin, right? And then as queer people thinking through queering the archive, it's very much about, queerness is about not being categorized or finding different ways. And I think that's what I'm interested in archives, is how can we not stick to these kind of boxes, you know, but what is the trajectory? How you know, the way that we kind of learned about the artists from the Black Arts Movement that we're now kind of in contact with and in touch through conversations, you kind of got more of a sense of how things were connected, you know, and how things happened rather than the single item, the single material. That's very much kind of where I'm coming from in terms of when I'm thinking about kind of a radical curriculum, radical pedagogy, or kind of unarchiving or activating archives. It's very much coming from, okay, thinking through these master's tools in a way, and like, what are our tools? What can we create for ourselves and for each other? I think there's kind of more organic ways of, for example, through conversation, you know, having a conversation with someone and them speaking about past experience or what happened back in the 80s is an archive, right? Oral archives, living archives, right? So there are many different ways, and then it's thinking about, well, you know, maybe archives are also about being in space together, you know, and thinking through space. So maybe we need to have more opportunities like we did with the roundtable. Maybe it doesn't have to be so distant or so fractured. We ended up creating this book, this publication, which was Surviving Art School. So it was kind of like this Artists of Colour toolkit that we wanted to create. Speaking about our experiences of art school, realizing that the more and more that we were having these roundtables, the more and more we were having conversations, we realized we're not alone. There were many of us. We were wanting to be outside of the institution in many ways, but also being pushed out of institutions at the same time. We went from producing this publication to then doing workshops around this publication in different art spaces, including in London, in Scotland, in Vienna. Evan Fukoya also put together, who's in our collective, put this together, this keywords for Tate as well. So we kind of produced this map, which was really thinking about, making our own canon, you know, mapping our own people, exhibitions, talks, conferences, workshops, and spaces. I think we really have to give that credit to Lubaina Hamid for her Thin Black Lines map, right? Because that did the same. It was doing this mapping of Black women artists at that time. I was very interested in, Audre Lorde and the kitchen table press in particular, because like I said, I was very interested in self-published materials. I was very interested in self-organized community-led movements. And I'd always been a part of them. That was always kind of as a feminist, as a queer person, as a trans person, I'd always been organizing and involved in those communities in London, particularly in the early 2000s. So I'm really interested in print because when we set up the collective, a lot of this kind of institutional critique is very much discourse-based. It's really discourse and that's it. And we kind of were feeling like we're saying the same things again and again, the same things that people said in the Black Arts Movement in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And, you know, when are things going to change? So we wanted to create practical resources. And for me, when thinking about zine culture and how it's unapologetic, we have our own agency. You can, this thing about your silence will not protect you, to speak up. So printed materials are tangible, they're material, right? They're something that can be shared and passed around. I think it's such an accessible medium and such a beautiful medium to be able to use. The zines actually that I created back in the 2000s connected me to many activist movements. So for example, activist movements in Berlin, which I was involved in, activist movements in India. The rise of digital is also amazing. So we use both. We have a Tumblr for the collective, for example. I use social media in a very strategic way, but I've connected with so many people through that. The Surviving Art School is online for free. You know, when we ran out of this, it was like, what do we do? And we have libraries and people all over saying, can we have a copy, you know? And I think conversation has been a big thing about my practice. I mean, I think I'm interested in conversation. I'm interested in this kind of concept of the unarchive. And I'm also interested in kind of collectivity and connectivity. Those are the things that are really kind of my practice is centered around. And I guess this broader sense of kind of resistance around that. So I created this map that was thinking through also energetic economies, because I was really interested in the economies of the art world and how it's really dependent on kind of this individualistic economy. It's really centered on this kind of capitalist economy. It's very kind of materialistic in this way. And I was thinking, yeah, the communities that I come from, the way that I've been organizing have not been that way. They've been kind of these energetic kind of economies. And this is something that Alexis Pauline Gumbs had also been speaking about. So yeah, I kind of wanted to kind of map all these intersections, and think through collectivity, connectivity, but also the problems that exist, but also the strategies. I realized that then somehow it was becoming this living archive, right? It was becoming kind of an archive, but it was also becoming an educational tool. And I'm also an educator. I'm interested in education. I started teaching in art schools and things like that. I was thinking, how can I create an artwork that decentralizes the kind of the individual artist, focuses on kind of collectivity and connectivity, because there's all these resources from many different creative practitioners. As you can see in the map, these points kind of connect to each other. Nothing is kind of isolated. These materials are archives in themselves. And I think even the conversation around the table is partly an archive, right? Maybe it's not helpful to use the word archive. Maybe it's also thinking outside of the archive. How do we learn about shared histories? How do we learn about these things? Does it have to be through an archive? What are the other materials, other ways? So my most recent project is Recipes for Resistance. It's the form of a publication, also an exhibition. There have also been workshops based around them as well. So basically, it's about the politics of food. And I remember saying to you earlier about institutions being really rigid, being hostile places, not feeling comfortable within them. As people of color, there's been a lot of kind of critical discourse about that. That was kind of juxtaposed to my experience of being socialized and growing up as like someone that I said as a Punjabi Sikh, with kind of this concept of seva and langar and feeding people. I always grew up around kind of community and food. And then kind of in my activist days in my early 20s and the early 2000s, being part of squatting cultures in Hackney, it was very much kind of around, organizing cafe spaces or spaces we came together, right? A lot of it was around food and bringing people together, even if we had different political beliefs, perspectives, cultural backgrounds, racial backgrounds, identities, basically. We would come together around food. But also, a lot of my practice has been around kind of colonial legacy and imperialism and thinking through kind of colonial trade and a big part of that being around food. I'm very interested in food. I'm trained as a chef and a pastry chef, and I've always been in community kitchens and so on. So I'm really interested in the politics of food. And I kind of use this project as a way also to have conversations. South Asia is so massive. And like in the UK, we have this term, the curry, which are kind of flattening down of all the kind of diversity that exists around kind of South Asian culture. But there's also these unspoken narratives, these unspoken kind of things that need to be discussed around gender, around caste, around queerness, but also beyond the arts. I wanted it to also reach other audiences and not to just be about art, right? Because I felt like art becomes very elitist. In an institutional setting, it becomes, kind of very exclusive. And I felt like the people I'm having conversations with are not necessarily going to art galleries or in art spaces. So I wanted to also, for this to kind of be circulating outside of the art world. So yeah, that's why the publication is great, because it went into people's homes. You can pick this up and, it can circulate basically. And I really like that. And so I wanted to have these conversations around the politics of food, but also the politics of identity. This is focusing on South Asian identity in particular, but it reaches broader, thinking about kind of migration and diaspora. It actually is kind of based on archives. So I was going to the British Archive, British Library Archive, and a lot of colonial archives for my own kind of practice around performance and print. I've made some print works based on colonial legacy. And what I was finding in the archives were really interesting things around food. There was a lot around kind of food and kind of coming into the UK and finding things unfamiliar, but then also adapting recipes. Like there's a masala baked beans recipe that we used in one of the workshops, for example, that a chef, Tanya Gohal, shared. And I kind of was like, yes, I have a masala beans recipe that I made. And I'm sure many people do, but it's not considered this official recipe, right? In the roundtable sessions, people would say, What would we be doing if we weren't doing this? Would we be painting flowers? You know? And it's like, yeah, we don't know, because that's our reality. This is our reality. We don't know what we would be doing outside of it. We're constantly negotiating, navigating, being in this country, in the UK, as migrants, as from the diaspora. And I think we bring all of that into it. That is who we are, so we bring that into our practices. But I think, yeah, the fact that we have to carve these spaces, or the fact that we have to make these movements for ourselves, it's labor, it's work, and it's labor, isn't it? That's the thing, and it's like we're not often resourced. You know, yes, we realize as a collectivity is strength, but it is a lot of labor to do that. And it's like you said, there's labor that you get paid for and you're compensated for, and there's labor that you're not. You know, so I think that's what it comes down to and then is it acknowledged? Is it valued? Right? So the whole undervalued energetic economy is about that. It's about value, right? What do we ascribe value to in a consumerist, capitalist kind of art industry that's impacted by the wider society we live in, right? And often, as people of color, we are undervalued, unfortunately, right? Or we have to kind of prove our value, or you know? So I think for me, that's the issue, really. I'm very pleased and grateful and thankful for all the networks and collectiveness that we've managed to nurture and grow. And I feel good. I feel in a good place about it, and I feel very inspired by my peers, by those who came before, by those who are doing things differently now. You know, I think those interactions have been tense, have been fruitful, have been, you know, there's a lot. You know, it's not a straightforward narrative of like we inherit things and they're good for us. It's complicated, but I feel really inspired by what people are doing and putting out there. And now it seems like the institutions that are so dry are like really want us, right? They're really thirsty. One. That's a good one. Let's get that one.